Salve te omnes, as we continue with our Olympians. Now it's time for Artemis. Her Greek name is Artemis. Her Roman name is Diana. So you've already learned about Apollo. Like I said in the Apollo video, Apollo and Artemis are the twin children of Zeus, not his wife Hera. We've talked about that, how Zeus is a bad husband. Their mother is a minor goddess called Leto, who isn't really featured in many stories besides the fact that she is the mother of Apollo and Artemis. So like we talked about when we were discussing Demeter and Persephone, it's difficult to tell the goddesses apart. That is, their appearances are very, very similar, so they really do need to be featured in a story to have some context to be able to tell which one's which. Artemis is the goddess of the hunt. That is, bows and arrows, deer. So one thing about Artemis that will allow you to tell who she is frequently is the fact that generally her dress only comes to her knees, whereas with the other goddesses you'll notice that it almost always goes down to their feet. This is to give her mobility so that she can be on the move, as she is a huntress, that is, out on the hunt. And the deer is sacred to her, which is very interesting. The Greeks frequently had a god or goddess represent like different sides of the same sort of, like two sides of the same coin. So for example, when we were talking about Poseidon, that he was the protector of horses, but frequently in the sculptures we'd see him stabbing a horse with his trident. So Artemis is the same way with her deer. She protects deer, but she also hunts them. And frequently it's very difficult for mortals in the stories to know which deer are sacred to Artemis and which ones are not. In fact, there's like no way for them to know. So there are a lot of stories that feature somebody who unwittingly kills one of her sacred deer and then needs to pay a horrible price for it, as she is a vengeful, bitter goddess. This is probably the most famous Diana / Artemis. It's found in the Louvre at Paris, which is really good because you can walk around it and look at it from all angles. Where is it? In a lot of museums, sculptures are up against a wall, so you can really only look at them from the front. Notice the detail of her dress and her hair, the quiver with the arrows in it. You might also notice that it does look like there's something in her hand besides the antlers here that very well might have been her bow, and it was broken off. We're not sure. I showed you this slide. Oftentimes, again, it's very difficult to figure out which one's Artemis and which one's Apollo, as they look very similar, since, as we talked about, Apollo never has a beard, isn't very muscular, and he's very boyish or even girlish in appearance. Note the deer here. Apollo and Artemis are twins. Again, if it's just her head, she pretty much just looks like any other goddess. Although, okay, this one's from Pompeii. So this one's really interesting to see because it's really tall. You look up at it, and Diana looking down at you is really scary. And this is Diana in front of the Temple of Apollo in Pompeii, so you can get really close to this and look right up at it. And it is as scary as the picture makes it seem. Remember being at Pompeii and just being frightened by this statue. That is, she is a scary goddess. Unlike Demeter, who represents food, and the harvest. Artemis is generally depicted as being angry, and frequently in the stories, she's going to be taking vengeance on mortals for various reasons. Again, she was Diana to the Romans. So like Apollo is associated with the sun and with light. Artemis is associated with the moon, so you might see moon symbols around her, like like a crescent moon. Here we see her in her hunter's guise. Here we see her with a deer. Here we see her with an arrow, again representing the hunt, and some slain animals below her. Again, frequently, just from looking at the face, as they're twins, Apollo and Artemis, Apollo and Diana, will look very, very, very similar. Very, very similar. Artemis, Diana. Okay, so the moon. Again, Apollo is associated with the sun. The sun to the Greeks was called Helios. And to the Romans that was called Sol, like where we get heliotropic plants that bend towards the sun, or solar power, which comes from the sun. And that generally went around with Apollo being the god of light in general, because the sun's generally the brightest thing. And his name Phoebus, and in Phoebus Apollo, Phoebus means shining. Associated with Artemis is Phoebe, although she's very rarely called Phoebe Artemis. The word Phoebe is kind of like a nickname or a title, but it can also refer to maybe another goddess that is associated with her. Apollo has a lot of minor gods associated with him that represent his various aspects. Like Asclepius represents medicine, Helios represents the sun, Orpheus represents music. So with Artemis, there are minor goddesses who either are her, who like represent one characteristic of her, or they're separate from her, and they kind of work together. Again, the Greeks were oftentimes kind of vague, or different Greek authors or artists were a little contradictory on this. So you might have it where Artemis is the moon, and to the Greeks the name of the moon was Selene, or we would say Selene, and to the Romans it was Luna. And in our Demeter folder, if you think back when we were talking about the underworld, I mentioned, and you saw a picture of the underworld goddess Hecate. In some depictions of her existence, Artemis is called the triformed goddess, where in the heavens she is the moon, she is Selene or Luna. On the earth, she is Artemis or Diana of the hunt, right? And then in the underworld, she's Hecate, Hades' helper. So you could think of like Helios or Sol, the sun, being associated with Apollo, or maybe he is Apollo. Selene or Luna, the moon, being associated with Artemis, or she is Artemis. And so here we see the moon imagery and the bow imagery. We've seen some of these paintings in Frederiksborg in Denmark for some of our other gods. So here is Artemis, and you'll notice that here she is the moon, and so it says Luna there, right? Again, Luna, Selene, Artemis, Diana, all either the same goddess or all versions of each other that are friends, kind of a thing. And so like Apollo or Helios, frequently depicted as like a chariot of fire or of light going across the sky. So here we see Artemis with the horses, with the reins, in her chariot representing the moon. Okay, so a story about Artemis. Artemis is on the hunt. Oh, and Artemis never marries. Artemis, like Athena, is a maiden goddess. That means she avoids men, she avoids gods. She never marries, she never has any children. And all of her attendants are female. That is, the nymphs, the minor goddesses that kind of hang out with her and accompany her, are always female. And they go out hunting. They spend the whole day out in the sun, in the woods, hunting deer, other animals. And the story of Actaeon, which is probably the most famous story involving her, that isn't part of a bigger story. Actaeon is a hunter, and he's out with dogs. And according to which version you're reading, like he might have like 50 dogs with all really fancy Greek names. And Actaeon accidentally stumbles upon Artemis bathing. And Artemis is so angry, even though he didn't mean to, even though it was an accident, that Artemis flicks some water on him and he starts to change. And as you can see here, he has changed into a deer, and at the point that he becomes a deer, his own dogs turn on him and eat him. And it's a fairly grisly scene. Here we see Artemis pointing her bow and arrows at him as his own dogs actually rip him apart with their teeth. Those are not very good boys. Close up of the dogs going into his throat there. And here in this one, you can see he's mid-transformation. He has grown his antlers, and his ears are starting to change. He's becoming a deer, and his dogs are starting to notice that he smells different. So the story of Actaeon is probably a really good example of like how brutal and vicious and uncaring she is. Again, he didn't do anything wrong. It was all an accident. So again, that is Artemis. She was associated with the moon and archery. And she is a maiden goddess. She never marries. She is the twin sister. Yeah, she's kind of scary, right? Let's leave that one right up there for a second. She is the twin sister of Apollo. Artemis, also known as Diana to the Romans. Artemis and Apollo are the children of Zeus and Leto. Okay, that's Artemis. Wa lete omnes.